again, everyone. Welcome to Cloud Wars Live, where we explore today's digital revolution by speaking with business executives and thought leaders who are changing how the world lives, works, plays, learns, and dreams. Our guest today is Ben Rewis, who spent a few decades in the fintech side of things, where he's helped companies including Visa, JP Chase, and First Data do some pretty wild digital transformations. So, Ben, thanks for joining us today. Great to have you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Ben, first I'd like to ask you, tell us a little bit about that background and how that plays into this really keen interest you've developed these days in AI.
Well, happy to do so. I started in tech, as you mentioned, a few decades ago, and I got exposed to AI kind of from the scientific computing side of things at an MIT think tank in Cambridge, where I met my wife, and I got into the internet after that, did some work building an intranet for a big insurance company, and realized that rules processing in insurance was starting to fool around with AI stuff. And then that company got bought, and I ended up relocating from Maine to California in 2000 to join Visa, where I ran internet e-commerce services for them, and got engaged in understanding how VisaNet started to do fraud-related activities, particularly transactional fraud. You know, when you do about 10,000 transactions a second, and you need to understand that, hey, you know, this one is coming from wherever, you know, Singapore, but this one's coming from Boston only a second later, that's probably not a valid transaction. So started looking at the fraud algorithms associated with real-time transaction processing, and that caught my interest. I went to JP Chase, built a copy of VisaNet for them to help integrate their merchant acquiring and issuer processing systems, and started building new products and services based on that kind of private transaction processing railroad that they established, helping with mobile and offers and rewards and things that used new rules processing as well. And then I went to First Data and helped them build out a token service provider, which is basically a cryptographic and encryption processing thing that lets tools like your mobile phone use Apple Pay and talk at the point of sale. So that's really all about security and transaction processing of tokens, which has actually a lot to do with fraud as well, and just trying to make it safer for the payments ecosystem. So I've come at it historically through the world of transaction processing, but I then took a break after First Data and started doing some work in the ag tech industry. And I noticed that in particular, transaction processing for financial payments and computer vision in the world of machine learning and robotics almost use the same kind of deep learning. So if you think of AI, which has a subset of machine learning, which has a subset of deep learning, and you start to look at the algorithms associated with fraud, they're ironically very similar to the algorithms associated with computer vision. So neural network processing that we started fooling around with 30 years ago in the supercomputer world for scientific computing has really cut across multiple industries and domains. And I was able to see that AI-related technologies and computer vision and financial transaction services were very similar. So I realized I could start to help lots of different types of companies as I moved into this next phase of my career, which is consulting. Hope that makes sense.
Oh, no doubt, Ben. So it's an interesting flip there from the financial technology and financial services business over to agricultural technology. You said you saw a link there. How is that playing out, and what's happening out there in the field?
Well, I see it happening in lots of different ways. As a kind of student of tech, I see AI really making a big difference in lots of industries. It's not just agriculture and finance. In fact, I'd argue that healthcare, automotive, financial services, retail, telecommunications, entertainment, manufacturing, all the major industries, transport, energy, logistics, especially with the advent of the IoT and going to 20 billion devices, right, in the next domain, they are all benefiting from artificial intelligence. And the reality of a market segment like ag tech versus a segment like fintech kind of to me is almost immaterial, right? What you're doing is automating everything. And what you're looking for is, 10x economy of scale, right? So like in the ag tech model, one example might be, a while ago they would farm a plot of land, and then they would start to think about farming a tree. Well, now what we're doing is paying attention to a square centimeter of a blossom, right? So if, for example, an apple tree has 2,000 blossoms and you want to cut it from 2,000 to 150 so you don't get the little golf ball size apples, you get the big juicy ones, we're able to actually create a time series history at a square centimeter level of the entire life cycle of that blossom. So that's more than 10x transformation. That's like 1,000x transformation or 10,000x transformation. Transactional security for fraud is a similar thing, right? So used to be when in the late 50s and 60s, when you called up Visa for authorization, they had literally a book and a person flipped the pages and looked through the book, right, to see if there was an approval for the transaction. Well, now it's done tens of thousands of times a second in real time, and loyalty and rewards and things are being built on top of that approval process, right? So it's not just the actual yes or no, this is good to go. It's value-added services being built on that. So that's, again, more than 10x transformation. The point is, that's happening in tons of different industries, all over North America, China, Europe. Agriculture and finance are benefiting in the examples I've given you, but I'm going to argue that AI and productivity resulting from it are probably the largest impacting elements of GDP growth that we could take advantage of for the global economy. In other words, if we're smart about continued investments in AI, and we're strategic about how to do that across industry, looking for opportunities like I'm pointing out of, convolutional neural networks in computer vision as being very similar mathematically to that in financial transaction processing. If we're looking for opportunities of reuse like that, we will probably, as a culture, figure out that AI is our biggest commercial opportunity. But with that opportunity comes risk, right? There's a threat.
Ben, I thought it was, is so interesting what you said a second ago. If we're smart about this, what are the ways that we can approach this in a smart way? And what are some paths we want to go down that are not so smart?
Well, I think unmitigated growth through lack of regulation, lack of governance, lack of policy, lack of process, and just focusing on innovation, invention, and disintermediation or things of that nature would be unwise. In other words, people, process, and tools, right? Think about the strategic investment and how to do things that focus, for example, on safety or policy and governance. I'll give you an example in the discipline of self-driving vehicles. Right, there's been a lot of movement, with Waymo and Google and the self-driving cars and all that stuff over the last several years, where automated vehicles require, through National Highway Transportation Safety and other regulating bodies, levels of certification that's based on, millions of hours of driving experience and, learning neural nets and things of that nature. And there's a lot of debate about what is actually safe. For me, it becomes like an interesting question around things like automated vehicles and, something like, what happens with humans when they get drunk and drive vehicles, right? There's manslaughter as one example. And then there's like intentional murder, right? Like you're a bad guy trying to go kill somebody and you're using the vehicle as a weapon. Well, a judge can make the call on, manslaughter versus intentional murder, And now think about autonomous vehicles, and it's not a person driving that. Right? But you have a similar policy issue around, well, wait a sec, that vehicle like intentionally went after somebody, right? That's like a governance and a policy thing that's around a domain of something they call the AI safety case. And the AI safety case is basically mathematically proving that, QED, 0% risk, this machine did not try to kill somebody, right? Or, this thing which was intended to cause harm to a terrorist, for example, didn't actually shoot a civilian, right? It's a really interesting concept when you think about like highway traffic safety, and then something like a farm, which has different regulations associated with it because it's private land, right? So it's now a guy's tractor on his land versus whatever, an unmanned Tesla driving down the highway at 80 miles an hour, and how those are in fact different than, well, this is actually a tank in, a foreign country defending our nation, right? Those types of use cases represent different needs for policy and different needs for understanding of rules and governance around how we as a society move forward in a safe way around this technology. And this becomes really important with, smart weapons, right? I personally think the need for governance in things like miniature drones, which can be weaponized, becomes even more important than our society is actually addressing. In other words, a while ago, nuclear weapons were the big concern, and so there was a lot of work done on policy of, assured mutual destruction and how to put in place government regulation. But, what's happening, for example, in that regard to tiny weapons and the need for governance and organizing and structuring that when, those military devices, which just like nukes, could get into the wrong hands, right? And so what I'm suggesting here is I think the need for policy and control and regulation is not keeping pace with that of innovation and invention, particularly in the space of AI. I know a lot of people opine about that, but I think it's really important that we just take kind of conscious approach to the fact that we're dealing with something that is both the largest commercial opportunity that society faces, as well as probably the most pressing ethical issue around safety, in particular, what war represents for our planet, right? So I think there's a ton of benefit for humankind, but also a ton of risk. And the things that we need to do to pay attention to that are the same things that we do around any tech for safety, the standards, the policy, the governance, the rules, that you need to pay attention to that, and don't let the pace of tech and invention outstrip the pace of control mechanisms necessary to keep society and the planet safe.
Ben, those are some compelling thoughts there, and I want to come back to the issue that you've described about the risk or the threat that comes up. But a couple minutes ago, when you talked about that intersection of, the people, processes, and the tools and the technology there.
Yep.
So this stuff is happening so quickly. What's the background, or what are the skill sets that somebody's going to bring to that who can help, appropriately guide corporations or, governments, the public sector around that, tricky three-part piece of people, process, and tools?
Well, I think there's a bunch of different little activities that sort of circle around those three legs of the stool. One is just experience with tech and realizing that, most technology projects don't fail because of the tech. It's typically because of the team or the implementation issues that they're facing, or, scope, schedule, cost. They didn't have the proper MVP, product strategy, et cetera, lined up. They tried too much too fast. They didn't understand the organizational change dynamics. Those are typically root cause failure issues more than the tech itself, right? Especially if somebody's vetted the tech and knows their stuff. So that talks about organizational experience and the need for understanding how teams work and leadership fundamentals in implementation. And that's, I think, true across all industries, whether it's AI or anything. So that's kind of the first piece on the people side, right? Just make sure you have the appropriate level of experience to get the job done. The second on the process side, I would say if you've looked at best practices across industry automation or process optimization, and you've bumped into Six Sigma or ITIL or any kind of IT best practice framework, you've seen that regardless of the industry, there are models to look into as documented, things like, I don't know, Carnegie Mellon's organizational capability maturity model on a scale of 1 to 5. Where is the organization? Are documented processes actually written down? Do people get trained in them? Are they followed? A highly performing entity like, a nuclear power plant where people die and there's great repercussions when processes aren't followed is very different than a startup who hasn't even bothered to think about compliance and written something down for a startup manual, right? Those levels of organizational maturity as seen by people who do compliance associated with process is the next, to me, big area to pay attention to. So you have the skill of the team and their experience level, and you have an understanding of organizational process maturity using best practices. Those, I think, are two of the strong pillars there around people and process. And the third, as it relates to tech, I think has much to do with the intention of what the organization is trying to do. Like, what's the desired outcome? What's the thing that they are trying to build, right? If someone is building a platform that they think is for a particular purpose, typically that platform, AI based or not, has multiple stakeholders. And the thing I've seen that is most helpful is, rather than think about disruption and turning the world upside down and taking advantage of it from a monetary point of view, the thing that I think is actually more helpful is understanding how the platform interacts in a positive way with multiple stakeholders, right? So what are the ways in which the ecosystem that you're bringing this technology into interacts with multiple players in the ecosystem? What's the value prop across multiple players, right? In finance, and what I was doing with transaction processing, it was the card holder or the device holder in the form of, the mobile phone, the merchant acquirer, their bank, the network, the interconnecting thing, the issuer. They all had stakeholder values, right? And you needed a value prop that worked for everybody. In the case of the ag tech thing, you have the farmer, you have their labor source, you have the people that are providing the advice and the science, the agronomists to the farmers. You have then the merchants and their distribution channels. So you need to understand, the ecosystem of those players in ag tech to be able to bring forward innovation. And my argument is that ecosystem awareness and how you have a strong value prop across that breadth and depth of players would be the third big leg of the stool, right? So experience management, strong process model observations for how you get economy of scale based on best practice, and then ecosystem-wide stakeholder value alignment for your product and service based on your platform. Those would be the three that I would riff on based on your question.
Well, we all know what happens if somebody tries to sit on a two-legged stool, Ben. Yeah. And are there, of those three, is it the third part, the tools that or the stakeholder alignment? Is that where is maybe the biggest gap exists right now?
For that AI opportunity and threat, it's probably all three. In other words, like I said, I think the commercial opportunities in all those industries is huge, right? And people are doing things to make a lot of money, right? Across all kinds of different sectors, right? I talk to folks who are using natural language processing, like, OK, Google and Siri to, impact the way they do things like insurance claims processing, right? Where you call in and you're talking through your recorded insurance call, or, satellite imagery, which, 30 years ago when I was doing the scientific computing stuff was about, visual inspection relating to military, but now is more about things like, hey, is that the roof of that house that we get from that satellite image, is that actually corresponding to the roof of this insurance claim? And let's look at the time series data of that roof over the last 20 years and make sure it makes sense to the million building claim that we're getting here. You know, that kind of GPS-based data analysis, you know, is popping up in all kinds of industries, not just insurance, right? So the tech is growing very quickly, and people are opportunistically realizing how to make money and business on it, which is great. But again, I think it's probably more along the lines of process and governance and rules for what is fair playing that becomes really tricky, right? I think this is more evident in industries where there is no central controlling entity, and it becomes IT in the middle of a thing that creates a transformation that is now a flat, it's no longer a hierarchy, like the consumer is in the middle or the device is in the middle, but the implications are just as big for society. You know, like take like Visa as a federation construct as an example, right? In the middle, there's an entity that spends a lot of money on writing rules, on policy, on things associated with compliance, and they publish those and they're followed. Then you look at something that is an uncentralized model, like a distributed Bitcoin ledger for blockchain, and it puts the consumer in the middle, and that's great because it creates all kinds of opportunities for commerce, but you don't have the same kind of central body that says, well, I can take a quarter from every dollar I make and put it into governance. I can put it into compliance. So they invest and fund it. So that means when you have these techs that are distributed like that, and there isn't necessarily a funding mechanism or a governance body to control the safety or issues around security, it gets really risky when that tech takes off and grows, you know, exponentially very quickly. So to me, that's more about government stepping in and choosing to have a role. And it's tricky, right? Because they're global. It's a flat world. It's a global world around borderless transactions. It's kind of like climate change, right? You need all the planets to line up for the countries to say, yes, I will save the planet, right? You can't have one opt out because one opting out doesn't help the earth. These things around these AI implications are similar conceptually to me. They need all parties to participate. And that's a tough call, right? Because it's a level of humanity around you know, doing the right thing for the planet or the tech that we don't do very well with, you know, 168 countries in the United Nations or whatever we are now. You know, it's just challenging. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think those are the types of things that need to be addressed as we move forward as a you know, a race.
Well, Ben, that's you know, again, you've given people lots to think about there. I wanted to toss in one thought on this. I saw an interview the other day. It was with the executive vice president of technology for IBM, John Kelly. He had just been over at the Vatican, and he had met some people from Microsoft as well as the Pope. And then he said, we spent most of our time with the pontifical think tank regarding, you know, these implications of AI. And he said one of the main issues that came out of this discussion was the notion of bias, and how do you ensure that the data that goes in to train the AI is done in such a way so that it's a level field there and bias is taken out. So can I ask on that, are you an optimist about the capability of these tools, these incredibly powerful transformative tools, being put into the market in ways that eliminate, you know, things that aren't so good, like bias?
Yeah, you know, there's a challenge with these machine learning systems that, you know, they're not like traditional products that you would think of, well, I'm going to define requirements and then I'm going to have some programmers code to get at those requirements, and then I'm going to produce a product that represents that. It, you know, these big database things that use this machine learning stuff using these data sets, it's really kind of almost unknown at some level exactly how that works, right? Like how these giant data sets create the sort of machine intelligence at some level. There's scientists are still stymied about some of that stuff, and they run into challenges around combining multiple data sets, like, one data set that's used for machine learning can't necessarily be conjoined with another data set produced by another set of, like, for example, computer vision cameras producing, class 1, another set of cameras producing class 2, taking both class 1, class 2, and then applying the same algorithmic structures against them. There's constraints that have existed because problems haven't been solved there. And that has something to do with the answer to your question about bias, because the data sets generated by multiple entities in this kind of learning model aren't necessarily heterogeneous, and they don't train the networks in ways that you'd like them to be to get the benefit and homogeneous input from all these different places. So what I would look to try and do if I had something to do with that level of policy at such large organizations as you mentioned, would be to fund high-level mathematical work associated with creating, things like interoperability on, data sets across multiple convolutional neural networks, with an effort to try and eliminate bias that could then be some sort of ethical baseline, right? As the rising tide floats all ships in this regard. If you can solve it across multiple players, you're going to help humanity in a way that I think is possible. I think there are smart people out there who could work on that. PhD thesis projects sponsored by even things like DARPA, right? You could put grants out there for the purpose of trying to create non-biased data set approaches, and try and encourage researchers and companies to solve for that, and then try and get in the same way that I was mentioning standards for safety, that are controlled, in automobile manufacturers. You could try and implement similar standards based on those mathematical approaches that you could ask AI firms to try and follow. But like most things in life, rules only get followed by people that want to follow rules, right?
Yeah.
So you still have issues, right, with the ethics of not following those things. But my point is, I think there might be a way to try and address that.
Well, Ben, this has been a fantastic conversation. You've gone from these 10x benefits across industries. Your example about the apple trees was extraordinary. I think that really brings to life, well, what does this mean? How could AI help in ag tech? How could a farmer begin to approach this sort of 10x productivity? How do you get to feed the world more effectively, to the risks, the challenges, killer cars, to bias, the Pope, other things coming on in here? How can the viewers here, Ben, and listeners learn more about the work you're doing and read more about some of the things that you've been writing?
Well, I have a website, benrewis.com. I put out a blog to talk about things like this. My contact info is on there. If you want to get in touch, I'm happy to brainstorm. I love working with teams that are doing digital transformation, whether it's a Fortune 100 or a startup. I love the idea of invention and creativity. I see it lots just in my daily life. You guys do too, right? You got email spam detection. You've got product recommendations coming into your Netflix queue. You've got, everything that, you would imagine happening in the form of AI around predictive image recognition for your iPhone, to say, oh yes, I see you were hanging out with mom last year. Let me give you a slideshow of all the pics with you and mom. That's going to continue to happen. I think that what's important is that people are realistic about how to build things, and they are pragmatic. And one of the things that I love to do is help teams think through that from their product and business strategy point of view. And if there's an opportunity for me to help with one of those things for any kind of AI related startup, I'd be happy to talk with them. And if it's a big company looking for a transformation, like what we did with Visa and JP Morgan Chase, those kinds of things are fun too. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you here today, and I hope that I hear from some of your folks. And
Sure.
I wish you continued good luck on Cloud Wars, and live long and prosper.
Ben, thank you very much. Just in case somebody's listening, hasn't had a chance to read it, could you spell out, your website where people can find more about you?
Ben Rewis, BenRewis.com.
Perfect. Ben, thanks for the good wishes. Really, you've raised some things that are going to keep a lot of people thinking for a while. These are important, big, vital things that you've brought up, and so it's great to balance on the one hand the optimism, the opportunity, the vast potential that exists, but as so often happens, there's another side to it, and I think you've
Yeah,
given all of us a lot to think about and be
yeah.
aware of as we charge into this crazy future.
Yeah, I got really lucky. I found technology and wilderness both at about the age of 17. I was writing code and doing mountaineering, and I found nature to be a really great teacher for me. And the combination of AI being both that which could have the highest impact on productivity and GDP growth at the same time as being probably the largest ethical issue we face in terms of war and terrorism. To me represents the duality of something like tech and nature. And we have to think about people as well as profit, right? And so, the big message for me is really just pay attention to both, and don't blindly go into profit and big business, but, pay attention to what it means for your kids' kids and how we live, and, try and leave the world a better place. And with that, I'll say thanks so much.
All right, Ben. Thank you. This has been great. Really enjoyed the conversation. And to all of you folks out there, thanks for being with us here at Cloud Wars. We look forward to seeing you next time.